She was 7 years old, knees pulled to her chest on polished tile outside the Dayton Regional Morgue intake door at 2:13 on a Wednesday in late November. Party store black tights laddered open at both shins, a station hoodie 3 sizes too big swallowing her wrists, and 2 damn Walmart sneakers placed side by side with their toes pointed toward the wall as if she had been taught, somewhere, that shoes stayed neat even when life did not. A folded flag rested in her lap, navy field turned inward, one corner smudged by a dark fingerprint of ash. The fluorescent lights hummed over her head and flattened every color in the corridor into hospital gray. She is not crying. She is not asking for anyone. She keeps touching the same stitched edge of the flag with 2 fingers, then stopping, then touching it again, like counting beads she cannot see. Past the fire door, rain hit the metal loading awning in a hard, steady rhythm, while the chapel gutters gave back a thinner sound, a silver dripping line that never quite stopped. The 2 notes braided with the low ventilation throb and the far mechanical sigh of automatic doors opening for people who still had places to go. The corridor smelled of antiseptic, wet concrete, printer toner, old coffee, and diesel from idling ambulances out back. The smell found seams in coats and clung there. At the billing window, clear plastic shields rose like office aquariums, and under one of them sat 3 copies of Montgomery County Release Protocol 11C, carbon paper sandwiched between white, pink, and yellow sheets, each one waiting for signatures no one wanted to request, in front of a child. Sandra Briggs had worked a night shift in that building for 11 years and 9 months, long enough to know where tile gave a fraction, under a heavy gurney wheel, and which elevator door closed too fast when the weather turned cold, long enough to identify every sound a corridor could make at 2 a.m. But she had never seen a child settle herself that way outside intake, still as a museum figure, as if she had been instructed to occupy as little space as possible. Sandra had 2 grown daughters in Indiana, one knee that flared in rain, and a habit of counting her steps between stations when the night got complicated. 12 from nurse's desk to vending machine. 23 from a vending machine to morgue hall. She made that walk at 2:16 and slowed when she saw the shoes first. The shoes were clean in a place where nothing else was. She stopped 6 feet away and crouched because adults looked less like authority and more like people from that level, because she had learned that much from years of pediatric overflow. And she said, "Honey, can you tell me who you're with?" The girl lifted her face once. Her lashes were clumped from rain, and there was a faint soot line where someone had brushed hair from her forehead with dirty fingers, then thought better of it. She did not answer. Her mouth stayed closed in a straight, practiced line. Sandra asked again, softer, and the child looked down to the folded flag as if that object, not the nurse, had asked the question. At 2:22, an orderly pushed a linen cart down the hall, glanced over, and kept moving. At 2:25, a chaplain in a brown jacket paused near the water fountain, watched for 3 seconds, pressed his lips together, and went through the side door toward oncology, because his pager had gone off. At 2:28, a woman in grocery store scrubs came out of the family restroom with swollen eyes, saw the child, whispered "Lord," and then hurried toward elevators with her own grief balanced in both hands. The building was full of people carrying private emergencies like glass bowls. Most of them kept walking. By 2:31, rainwater had seeped through the cuff of the child's left sock and made a crescent stain on the tile. She took the sock off, wrung it once with careful, small hands, and laid it flat on her knee. Then she resumed the same posture, one hand on the flag, one hand at her ankle, shoulders rounded inward. The restraint in it made Sandra feel a slow, unwelcome heat rise behind her collar. Children in hospital halls usually cried, asked for tablets, asked for juice, asked for somebody. This one sat in silence and arranged objects. Silence was the part people remembered later. At 2:37, Sandra called security desk B and asked if they had a minor reported missing. They did not. She called social services on call and got voicemail. Then the backup number and got voicemail there too. 2 recorded voices in 2 different tones saying to leave a detailed message after the beep. She left one. At 2:43, she asked the desk clerk, Margot Tilley, to pull intake logs for next of kin in the last 4 hours. Margot tapped keys, frowned, and said the release queue was backed up by a weather wreck and 1 line of duty transfer. She did not look up when she said it because she was reading coded fields in a system built to describe bodies and billing, but not 7-year-olds on tile floors. The girl moved only when the vending machine clicked and dropped a bag of pretzels for a respiratory tech at 2:49. The sharp crack of the spiral coil made her flinch, quick and complete, then go still again. Sandra watched that reaction and marked it away the way experienced nurses do, without any drama attached to it. Startle threshold high until sudden metallic impact. Hypervigilance wrapped in obedience, not sleeping, not seeking, holding one item as anchor. In another context, she would have charted those observations. Here there was no chart open yet, and no legal category that fit the hallway. Outside, the city shifted 1 hour toward dawn. Dayton, in late November, moved under low cloud and sodium lamps. River wind nudging rain sideways across overpasses, semis throwing spray on 875, bus shelters slick and shining under advertisement lights for winter sales no one in this corridor was shopping for. The volunteer firehouse, 2 blocks west, had stale coffee in a dented stainless urn and a calendar still turned to October because no one had remembered to flip it. In the hospital basement, the boiler kicked and settled with a pipe-tick rhythm that came up through walls like a second pulse. Ordinary weather, ordinary systems, ordinary failure in triplicate. At 3:04, Sandra brought a warm blanket and held it out. The child accepted it without speaking, folded it in half, set it over her thighs, and returned her hand to the flag's corner. No gratitude performance, no resistance, no request for more. Sandra sat on the opposite wall and stayed there. She did not trust what would happen if she left the hall empty, even for a minute, because emptiness had already done enough work tonight. At 3:11, Margot printed a provisional estimate from billing and slid it into a manila folder stamped "Hold for Release Authorization." The total line sat near the bottom in block digits, 12,870.00. Under it, transport and preparation, 1,940.00. Under that, a red note, Protocol 11-C applies. And the folder stayed closed on the counter, but numbers have a way of changing the pressure in a room. Sandra felt that too. It was 3:17 when the first distant engine note reached the corridor glass, low and layered, different from ambulance idle and different from delivery trucks, a rolling syncopation that rose, dipped, and rose again, as if multiple machines were keeping one rough breath. Margot looked up. The security monitor by Desk B showed headlamps in pairs, turning off Salem Avenue in disciplined spacing. Not fast, not reckless, but too many to be incidental at that hour. A guard said over radio, "We've got bike traffic stacking north entrance." Another voice answered, "Copy. South entrance too. Multiple units. Stand by." By 3:24, the sound pressed against the building with physical weight, through glass, through metal framing, through the cheap holiday garland taped above the volunteer desk. Nurses at Station C slowed, charting, and drifted toward windows orderlies clustered near the staff door, and 2 residents from internal medicine peered down from the second-floor rail with that sharpened expression people wear when they expect trouble and want to be first to witness it. Chrome flashed through rain in intermittent strips. Black leather darkened to near blue under parking lot LEDs. Patches moved in and out of visibility as riders dismounted and regrouped with the automatic precision of people who had done this before. No one had asked for a show of force, and yet a force had arrived. A unit secretary whispered, "How many is that?" Security tried to count on monitor grids and lost track at 82 at north, 57 at south, then more entering from side access by pathology, headlights queuing under overpass spillway, and along service road shoulders where city buses usually idled for schedule resets. Road captains checked in by radio with clipped numbers, exits named one by one, staging points assigned in miles and minutes. By 3:39, the tally crossed 300, then kept climbing. Rain struck helmets and patched shoulders and ran off in lines. No one revved for spectacle. No one shouted. They just kept arriving. At 4:02, with the corridor clock dragging toward the thin light before dawn, dispatch gave Security Desk B a final count from traffic cameras and hospital perimeter reports, and the number landed with ceremonial certainty. 650 riders positioned at entrances, under overpasses and along the planned route corridors, waiting in quiet formation, while inside the building, a 7-year-old sat barefoot on tile with a folded flag in her lap and did not once ask what was coming. At 4:03, the corridor held its breath in a way that made every small machine sound louder than it had a minute earlier. The ice maker dumping a tray in the family lounge, the monitor chirp from the triage 2 floors up, the plastic click of Margot Tilley's pen as she set it down and forgot to pick it up again. Through the rain-speckled glass at the far end, headlamps idled in ordered rows, and men in cut vests stood beside their bikes with their hands visible and empty, shoulders squared against cold, waiting without drifting toward the doors. Sandra watched the nearest one lower his helmet onto his seat, as carefully as if he were setting down something breakable. She had spent nearly 12 years reading threat in posture before words arrived. What she saw outside was not hunting. It was containment. Security Desk B crackled with updates that came fast enough to overlap. North lot full. South ambulance lane clear except 2 lines staged. No weapons seen. No aggressive behavior. The guard on Channel 3, a former Marine named Phil, who never softened his assessments to calm administrators, spoke in a flat voice that carried farther than intended down the hall. They're running perimeter discipline. Somebody trained this? He said it like an observation, not praise, and Sandra heard the subtle shift under the sentence anyway. Fear had been first. Precision followed it. Precision changed the room. The paradox sat in plain view before anyone named it. The men most people taught themselves to fear had arrived more organized than the institution inside the walls. They did not pound on glass. They did not shout for attention. They occupied assigned spaces and waited for instructions the hospital had not yet learned how to give. At 4:06, the side stairwell door opened, and Vince Anderson stepped into the corridor carrying rain on his shoulders and the sharp outside scent of wet asphalt and diesel. He was tall enough that the fluorescent fixtures flattened along his jacket seams, left cheek marked by a pale, jagged scar that pulled slightly when he clenched his jaw, sun-faded hair gone silver at the temples, a spine that made him pause 1 second before he straightened fully. He wore his patch over plain black thermals and old jeans darkened at the knees from road spray. His boots left crescent prints on the tile that evaporated into smudges within seconds, under recycled heat. He did not look at security first. He looked at the child, then at her shoes, then at the folded flag in her lap, and Sandra watched his face settle into a stillness she recognized from emergency rooms and waiting rooms and military funerals where no one in uniform could afford to break posture. Margot found her voice before anyone else. "Sir, you can't have all those men blocking emergency access." Vince turned his head toward the desk without moving his feet, eyes level, hands open at his sides. "They're not blocking your lanes," he said. "Road captain left 12 feet clear at both bays and 1 full turn radius for your rigs." Margot blinked once, then checked the monitor, then checked it again. He was right down to the inch. From the chair by intake, the girl kept her gaze on the flag, fingertips traveling the stitched edge, stopping, returning. She still did not cry. That was the detail that kept finding Sandra and refusing to leave. A 7-year-old barefoot in a morgue hall, while 650 riders waited in the rain, and the only person in that building who looked composed enough to endure it was the child. At 4:09, Sandra's phone buzzed with the delayed callback from social services on-call, the same line that had sent voicemail at 2:37. She answered in a low voice, gave the case facts in clipped sequence, listened, then stared at the opposite wall while the reply came through in policy language stripped clean of shame. Earliest responder availability was 7:30. Paperwork priority triage due to weather surge. Minor can remain with legal guardian if guardian is present and nonviolent. Sandra repeated the time once, ended the call, and entered the note in the electronic chart shell she had opened without a patient number. External contact logged. Outcome delayed. By 4:12, Sister Agnes from Hospital Pastoral Care appeared at the corridor mouth with her cardigan buttoned wrong and rain shining on her sleeves. She was 62, left ear aided by a beige hearing device she never hid, and she had spent 26 years inside institutions that liked compassion in mission statements and budget cuts in practice. She stopped when she saw Vince and the line of riders on the monitor wall. Her mouth tightened in reflex, then softened when she followed his gaze to the child. She crossed herself once, not dramatically, and moved to sit on the bench by the vending machine where she could witness without crowding. In a building of badges and policies, that small act counted as choosing a side. The thing people from outside often missed about Dayton Regional at that hour was how physical bureaucracy felt. It was not abstract. It had weight and smell and texture. Carbon forms left blue on fingertips. Laser printers heated paper until it gave off a faint metallic sweetness. Badge doors clicked open with a note almost identical to the snack machine coil, and children who startled easily learned that sound map quicker than adults admitted. The morgue intake counter held tape residue from 3 years of changing signage, and the replacement sign, release authorization required prior to transport, had been laminated crooked so the words tilted down toward the right like a tired warning. Behind glass sat envelopes of personal effects, tagged in thick marker, wedding bands in zip pouches, burned watches, wallets with melted edges from house fires that outlived their owners by hours. Institutions stored grief in office supplies. At 4:16, Vince stepped to the window beside the intake door and looked out over the service lane. Rain thinned to a fine slanting mist, and then thickened again, wind pushing it under the awning in diagonal lines. Road captains signaled with 2-finger motions and flashlight taps, moving riders half a bike length at a time to keep drainage grates clear. Nobody gunned a throttle. Engines idled low, each one a separate pulse inside a single body of sound that seemed to rest in Vince's ribs rather than in his ears. He had lived long enough with noise, rotor wash, convoy chatter, steel doors, courtroom benches scraping concrete, to know the difference between chaos and force under control. Outside was force under control. He returned to the chair line and lowered himself onto the bench opposite the child, knees angled so he did not box her in. He set one pair of knit gloves on the tile between them, not offering, not insisting. After a long half-minute, she looked up once and then down again. He said, "Name's Vince." She watched his hands. She did not answer. He accepted that and stayed where he was. At 4:21 on that same wet Wednesday, dawn began as a lightening of the east-facing service windows rather than true sun, a diluted pewter glow that gave shape to parked ambulances and the thin branches beyond the loading dock fence. The city outside shifted from overnight silence to early labor. A sanitation truck grinding second gear on Kiowa, a bakery van braking hard at the corner by the old pharmacy, freight train horn from the river line rolling low through damp air and arriving in the hospital walls as vibration more than sound. The volunteer firehouse 2 blocks away switched from stale coffee to fresh at 4:20 every weekday because Captain Ruiz believed routines kept people alive. The first pot always smelled scorched for 6 minutes because the warming plate ran hot, and that smell drifted across the alley and into the receiving bay whenever the wind turned south. This morning it did. Rachel Hale stood at last from the billing window where she had been folded over a clipboard for almost 20 minutes. Station, hoodie sleeves, dark at the cuffs, hair tied back with a child's elastic that had stretched beyond trust and been knotted once to hold. 34 looked older under fluorescent light and no sleep. She carried the manila folder against her chest as if she expected someone to take it and run. When she saw Vince across from her daughter, she hesitated, reading his patch first, then his face, then the empty space he had left around the child. Her voice came out hoarse from disuse. "You with them?" He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She swallowed and glanced toward the glass where rows of riders stood in rain that refused to choose between stopping and continuing. "I can't pay that," she said, barely above a whisper, and she lifted the folder a fraction, as if proof was required. Vince did not reach for the paperwork. "I know." The line held there, thin as wire, while the building listened. At 4:27, Margot slid the Protocol 11C packet from under the plastic shield and set it on the counter edge with 2 fingers, the way clerks pass over documents when they are trying not to look responsible for what the documents say. Rachel opened it to the total page, then to transport, then to release terms, each sheet cracking slightly where rain had dried and stiffened the corners. Sandra watched Vince track the numbers without touching them, mouth flattening at the red hold stamp. In his left hand, near the thumb, old fracture ridges stood out pale as rope under skin. 20 years on the road and older histories beneath that had taught him how systems protected themselves first. He read the packet as a map of refusal. Across the hall, Sister Agnes stood and approached the desk with a steadiness that was almost formal. "Please note in the record," she said to Margot, "that family has continuous support present." Margot looked uncertain, then typed it into the open field because a nun asking for documentation in a hospital still carried a kind of authority no policy memo could quite erase. Loaded setup paid forward in a single sentence. Someone who had watched now became witness on the record. By 4:31, the rain eased enough that individual drops could be heard again instead of sheet noise, ticking on the aluminum downspout outside intake in a slow, irregular pattern, like coins hitting a bowl. The child moved for the first time in several minutes, reached for her socks, and put the damp left one back on without complaint. Then she slid her shoes 2 inches closer together until their edges touched, telling detail, small and clean and unbearable. Even now, she arranged what little could be arranged. The hospital clock advanced with stubborn indifference. Housekeeping cartwheels squeaked at the far end, near pathology. Someone laughed once in an elevator and then went quiet when the doors opened onto this floor and they saw the corridor, the child, the riders beyond the glass. Dayton kept doing what cities do at daybreak. Deliveries, shift changes, coffee, exhaust, rain, and inside this narrow strip of tile and fluorescent hum, the center of the story remained fixed. A widow with invoices she could not meet, a girl who had run out of tears before dawn, and a wall of men outside whom polite people distrusted on sight, waiting to be told where help was needed and how far the road would run. At 4:33, with rain ticking the downspout in uneven beats and dawn still a diluted gray behind service bay glass, Vince rested his forearms on his knees and kept his hands open where the child could see them. He had learned long ago that hands told the truth faster than faces did. Across from him, her shoes touched edge to edge, her fingers found the stitched corner of the folded flag, and the hallway's fluorescent hum settled into the same register as idling engines outside, a low current under every breath in the building. 48 years had left their record on him in places clothing did not hide. The left cheek scar was a pale seam from shattered glass in a convoy rollover outside Basra in 1991, the kind of wound medics stapled shut while sand moved through everything, and no one pretended sleep would come that night. 2 knuckles on his right hand sat flatter than nature, intended from old breaks set late. His lower back gave one sharp pop almost every time he stood after sitting more than 10 minutes. The tattoos on his forearms, once dark as fresh ink, had gone blue-gray and blurred at the edges, names and dates softened by sun, oil, and years of road grit. People who saw him in daylight often made quick decisions and then congratulated themselves for caution. They saw the cut vest, the scar, the heavy boots, and crossed streets. They locked doors in parking lots. They tightened their grip on handbags, children, assumptions. Vince had stopped taking that personally sometime in his 30s, not because it had become fair, but because he had learned the economy of spending anger only where it could protect somebody. Most days, prejudice was a weather. He rode through it. His service record had ended without ceremony. A medical discharge and a paper packet that used the right terms without understanding any of them. Home had been Ohio, then not home for years. Machine shops, freight loading docks, a 6-month stretch, sleeping behind a shuttered bowling alley in Moraine when rent outran wages by one missed check, and then another. He married at 26 because love felt like a line he could hold. He divorced at 32 because unprocessed war and rotating shift work and too much silence in a 1-bedroom apartment could grind down even patient people. His sons were grown now, Tyler in Indianapolis and Ben somewhere outside Toledo last he heard, both carrying his last name, and almost none of his daily life. He called on birthdays. Sometimes voicemail answered. Sometimes no one did. The county lockup came after a bar parking lot in 2008, after he had stepped between a drunk foreman and a 19-year-old apprentice with braces still on his teeth. He hit first and hit too hard and kept hitting 3 beats after the danger was over. The judge said 8 months. Vince served 8 months. In lockup, he relearned structure at a scale no one romanticized. Concrete, count times, plastic trays, noise that never fully shut off. He also relearned a harder rule than pride liked to accept. Violence without discipline was just another form of cowardice. By the time he patched into Iron Saints, he was old enough to distrust stories men told about themselves and young enough to need a place that ran on commitment instead of promises. The chapter gave him labor before belonging. Overnight charity runs, cemetery escort details in sleet, towing stranded riders who had cursed them in gas stations 6 months earlier. He earned trust by showing up. He kept earning it by showing up again. In 20 years, he had buried 3 brothers, carried one through relapse, and watched another relearn speech after a stroke. None of that made headlines. It made muscle memory. A nurse pushed a med cart past intake, wheels whispering over tile seams, and Vince tilted his shoulders to give her room without breaking eye contact with the girl. Sandra noticed the movement and filed it with the rest of her observations. Because precision like that in a man his size did not happen by accident. Sister Agnes, standing near the vending machine with her cardigan still misbuttoned, watched the same gesture and recognized it from another world. Pallbearers adjusting a casket through narrow church aisles so no corner clipped a pew. Care looked different on different bodies. The underlying mechanics were identical. Vince had never liked hospitals. The smell carried him places he preferred to leave buried. Antiseptic over metal over old fear. Corridor clocks louder than they should be. Forms asking for facts, while the important parts of a life stood in hallways, holding themselves together with habit. He came tonight for Calvin Pike in room 4B, chapter secretary, 61, bypass surgery delayed twice because of insurance coding and then emergency add-ons. Vince had promised he would check in after midnight when the waiting room emptied, and nurses had enough margin to answer one clear question. He planned to stay 20 minutes. No more. He parked at 152 on the lower service lot, rain pinning his jacket to his shoulders before he made the awning. The front desk clerk gave him a visitor sticker after one long look at his patch and a shorter look at his face, the calculation plain as handwriting. Trouble potential, manageable if watched. He accepted the sticker and put it on without comment. Security pointed him to elevator C and reminded him of visiting limits in a tone used for men expected to test limits. He nodded once and walked. At 2 o'clock, the hallway outside cardiac step-down was almost empty. Televisions muted, coffee machine blinking out of order in orange block letters, one family asleep in molded plastic chairs under a wall mural of a river, no local recognized. Calvin was pale but stable, chest rising in measured work, IV pump clicking at exact intervals. He woke long enough to ask whether the bikes were covered and whether his dog had been fed. Vince said yes to both. He stayed 12 minutes, adjusted the blanket at Calvin's shoulder because the nurse was tied up in another room, and left before gratitude became awkward. He should have taken the same elevator down and ridden home to a dry garage and 3 hours of fractured sleep. Instead, he cut through the lower corridor by pathology because the vending machine there still took cash, and the one upstairs did not. At 2:13, stepping around a yellow caution sign near intake, he saw 2 small shoes lined up against a wall that had no business holding children at that hour. Something in him locked onto the detail with old, automatic certainty. The shoes were cheap black canvas with 2 pink stars on each heel, soles worn down at the outer edges, laces tied in careful double knots. They were not abandoned. They were arranged. He followed the line of them to the child on tile, knees to chest, flag in her lap, left sock damp and dark at the cuff. She sat so still, the fluorescent light seemed to move around her instead of over her. Not crying, not fidgeting, not even looking toward footsteps as people passed. He had seen that level of stillness in children twice before. Once in Kuwait after a mortar alarm, when a boy no older than 9 held his sister under a stairwell and did not blink for 20 straight minutes. Once in county court, When a foster kid waited outside a hearing room and folded the same paper airplane until the paper tore. It was never calm. It was the body spending its last reserve on control. A billing window light snapped off and on as the system refreshed. Vince glanced up and saw the woman behind the plastic shield slide a folder, pause, slide it back. At the end of the counter stood Rachel Hale in a smokehouse hoodie with fire rescue, half worn off the chest print, hair tied with a stretched elastic, one palm flattened against the edge of the desk as if keeping herself upright by agreement with gravity. She did not see him then. She was reading numbers the way people read impact reports, searching for the sentence that might make them less true. From 2:15 to 2:29, he watched 6 adults pass within 10 feet of the child and keep moving. An on-call pastor carrying a leather Bible, a deputy in uniform pants and gym shoes, 2 social work staff trading shift with tote bags on their shoulders, a chaplain with a buzzing pager, a man in contractor coveralls, smelling of wet drywall. One paused. None stopped. Institutional life rewarded staying inside assignment. The hallway made that plain. Vince moved to the opposite wall and lowered himself to a crouch, so his eyes landed below hers, then set his gloves on the floor between them. "I'm Vince," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." She did not answer. Her fingers stayed on the flag seam. Her gaze tracked his hands, then the scar near his thumb, then the patch on his vest, as if deciding whether symbols meant danger or shelter tonight. At 2:31, Sandra came down the hall with a blanket, saw Vince first, and tightened her jaw for one beat. He gave a single nod and shifted back enough to leave her approach clear. She offered the blanket to the girl. The girl took it, folded it exactly in half, and laid it over her knees. Sandra looked at Vince again, this time longer, and sat on the bench without telling him to leave. Mutual assessment completed in silence. By 2:37, when Sandra was leaving voicemail on social services, and Margot was muttering at frozen fields on her monitor, the child finally spoke. The words were so low he leaned in to hear them over the ventilation, noise, and rain. "Please don't let them burn him because we're broke," she whispered. The sentence hit him with physical force, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a pressure behind the sternum that spread outward until his arms felt suddenly too heavy for the air. He turned toward the billing window. Rachel had heard it too. She closed her eyes once, opened them, and crossed the 2 steps to where he crouched near her daughter. Up close, she looked younger and older at once, skin blanched by fluorescent light, soot faint under one thumbnail, lips split at the center from dehydration. She held out the top page of the estimate with a hand that did not quite hold steady. "Can you help me bring him home?" she whispered. In another version of his life, he might have asked for details first, verified affiliation, called somebody else, built a plan from a safe distance. That version had gotten people hurt on roads and in cell blocks and in waiting rooms where everyone expected someone with cleaner credentials to act. Hesitation wore professional clothes and called itself procedure. He knew that pattern too well. He stood, took the page, read the totals once, and looked at Rachel without softening what came next. "Yes," he said. At 2:40, he stepped into the service bay, rain cold through his shirt in under 10 seconds, and pulled his phone from his inside pocket. The concrete smelled of diesel, wet cardboard, and brake dust. Ambulance lights washed the cinder block wall in alternating red and white, turning his hands 2 different colors each second. He called Eli Mercer, chapter vice president, who answered on the second ring with no greeting because men like that only answered overnight calls when it mattered. "Full honor run," Vince said. "Now." He ended the call, put the phone away, and went back inside to the corridor where the child sat, with her folded flag and her neat shoes and her practiced silence. By the time he reached the bench again, the first distant engines had already begun to gather under the rain. But inside the corridor, the old rhythm of institutional delay still tried to hold the room in place. Vince sat back down on the bench across from the child, water still dark on his shoulders, while Margot at the billing window reopened screens she had already opened twice, and Sandra lifted the handset again because procedure wanted one more call before action could count. The fluorescent lights gave everyone the same exhausted color. Only the folded flag in the girl's lap kept its shape. At 4:35, Sandra asked security to pull camera playback for the intake hall from 2 o'clock forward and log every person who passed within 10 feet of the chair line. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech. She requested a report the same way nurses requested, stat labs, and the guard on desk B, Phil with the marine haircut and steady monotone, sent the feed to the monitor by morgue intake and started a handwritten count when the software lagged. Margot printed a fresh copy of Protocol 11C because the first packet had curled at the corners from damp fingers. Rachel stood near the counter, one hand flat on the manila folder, as if paper could drift away if not anchored. Her daughter kept touching that same stitched edge of the flag. 2 fingers, pause, 2 fingers again. The count reached 39. Sandra made Phil read it back to avoid error, then had him read the rolls attached to faces when badges or uniforms made them plain. A pastor from 3rd Street with a tan overcoat and rein on one shoulder. An off-duty deputy still in uniform pants and tactical boots, coffee cup in hand. 2 social workers switching shift with county lanyards visible above their jackets. A hospital chaplain with a pager clipped to his belt. The battalion chief's administrative assistant carrying a tote full of forms. 3 neighbors from Halsted Street who had hugged Rachel in the parking lot and told her they were praying. A funeral home representative who said he could not proceed without confirmation from billing. A volunteer coordinator from a local relief office who took a pamphlet from the rack and left it on a chair. 28 more people, whose names the system did not capture, but whose steps crossed that tile and kept moving. 39, no one put money on the counter, not one. Sister Agnes moved closer, cardigan still buttoned wrong, hearing aid catching the corridor light like a pale bead. She watched the monitor in silence until Phil paused the feed on the frame, where the deputy looked directly at the child's shoes and then turned away toward the elevator bank. "Document that frame," she said, and Margot, after a glance toward administration offices that were still dark at this hour, saved it to the incident folder. Physical evidence acquired. Camera still, timestamp 2/24/17, child seated, adults passing. Sandra added it to her notes beside the estimate sheet amounts and the red hold stamp under 11C. Rachel did not look up during any of it. She kept her eyes on the folder, breathing shallow, as if reading the same numbers again might produce a different arithmetic. By 4:38, rain had shifted from hard drops to fine needles and back again, and the corridor windows fogged at the edges from the difference between wet cold outside and recycled heat inside. Vince listened while the list of passers continued, and each roll landed with the same dull force: person with authority, person with training, person with proximity, person with words, none with intervention. He did not need the indictment explained. He had spent years watching systems call themselves overburdened, while one human being did the carrying. Still, hearing 39 spoken aloud in that hall, with the child close enough to hear if she chose, tightened something in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. Sandra ended the enumeration only when the details were pinned to paper and the external calls were logged with outcomes. Social services callback, delayed until 7:30 due to surge. County release desk night line, no exception granted without verified payment instrument. Pastoral care note entered by Sister Agnes. Family support present, minor present, financial barrier active. Each contact had gone where contacts go at that hour, into voicemail trees and policy language. The record now showed it. The record would not have to pretend later that no one knew. The child shifted for the first time in several minutes and leaned slightly toward her mother without taking her eyes off the flag. Rachel lowered herself onto the chair beside her, knees close, hoodie damp at the elbows, and reached to smooth hair back from the girl's forehead. The hair had been braided at some earlier point and partly undone by rain, two careful sections hanging loose, as if someone had started the morning believing there would be school, lunch boxes, ordinary things. Rachel's hand shook once and steadied. She looked across the narrow gap to Vince. "Her name is Lily," she said. Vince nodded once. "I'm glad to know it." Lily kept her gaze downward, jaw set in that practiced line children borrow from adults when they decide they cannot afford to unravel. She did not ask for water. She did not ask why there were motorcycles outside. She did not ask where anyone had taken her father's boots, or whether smoke still lived in the fabric of his station jacket. She sat with knees tucked and the folded flag anchored in her lap, like a weight that could hold the floor in place. The absence of panic was the sharpest thing in the room. At 4:41 on that wet Wednesday, the first bakery truck of the morning braked at the light beyond the service lane, and the smell of fresh bread threaded once through diesel and antiseptic before disappearing into rain. Rachel opened the folder and turned it toward Vince. The paper showed every charge in sterile columns, all final. Funeral service and facility, $12,870. Transport and preparation, $1,940. Administrative release processing under Montgomery County Protocol 11C, pending full settlement. Margot had highlighted the release line in yellow that looked almost cheerful under fluorescent light, an office color, pressed into the wrong duty. Rachel tapped that line with her index finger, then stopped when she realized Lily was watching her hand. Lily finally spoke without lifting her head. The whisper came thin but exact, threaded through ventilation noise and distant engines. "Please don't let them burn him because we're broke." No one in that hall pretended not to hear it. The sentence did what facts and forms had not done. It put plain language where bureaucracy had hidden consequence. Sandra looked away to the monitor bank and swallowed once. Sister Agnes pressed her fingertips to the cross at her collarbone and then let her hand fall. Margot set her pen down and did not pick it up again. Vince leaned forward, forearms on his thighs, staying low enough that his height did not crowd the child, and answered in the same quiet register she had used. "They won't," he said. Lily's fingers tightened on the flag seam. "Promise?" He held her gaze for the first full second since he had entered the corridor. "I promise." Rachel made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite breath, then covered her mouth with her sleeve and looked at the floor until she could speak again. "He was at Station 14 for 11 years, she said, words rough from dryness. "He did 2 doubles this week. I thought overtime would catch us up." She stopped, blinked hard, and looked at Vince as if ashamed to have said even that much. "I called 3 people. I called his captain, my neighbor, my cousin in Springfield. Nobody can do this number." Vince did not offer sympathy language. He had none that would not ring false against stamped totals in a child's whisper. He took the top sheet from her only long enough to read the account number and payment desk extension, then handed it back exactly as he received it, corners aligned. "Keep every page," he said. "Don't lose one receipt when they print them." She nodded without asking why. Lily shifted the blanket higher on her legs and leaned closer to her mother's side. Her voice came again, barely louder than before, but directed now at Vince with simple, impossible trust. "Can you stay till he goes home?" He answered without pause. "Yes." The hallway remained quiet for 2 beats after that, as if the building itself had to recalibrate around a promise made outside its official channels. Then the intake printer woke and spat a cover sheet no one had requested, and the ordinary sounds returned. Wheel squeak, vent hum, rain on awning, engine idle, rising and falling in disciplined intervals beyond glass. Vince stood, joints protesting in the small ways they always did now, and turned toward the service bay door. He glanced once at Sandra. "Watch them for me." She gave a single nod, nurse to Ryder, no ceremony. He stepped through the fire door into the wet cold, where mist beaded on his scar and ran down the collar of his vest. Outside, riders held position in long black rows under lot lights, helmets on seats, faces turned toward the building but not toward the doors, waiting for instruction, with the patience of men who understood timing could be the difference between help and spectacle. He walked 3 paces out from the awning, far enough that the phone signal stopped dropping against the concrete walls, and dialed Eli Mercer again. Eli answered on the first ring this time, wind noise and engine note loud on his end. "Need treasurer and notary," Vince said. "Bring cash, cards, and receipt books. Full settlement at desk." Eli did not ask for explanation. "How much?" 14,810 before incidentals, maybe higher. A short pause, then, "Done." Vince ended the call and stood still for one measured breath while rain tapped the asphalt around his boots. He did not wave, did not grandstand, did not signal dramatic urgency. He simply lifted 2 fingers toward the nearest road captain and pointed once toward the intake entrance. The captain relayed the motion downline with flashlight taps, and riders nearest the north lane shifted half a bike length to clear a wider channel for hearses and hospital rigs. No engines revved. Formation tightened. When Vince came back through the door, cold air followed him, and then thinned into the corridor heat. Lily watched him cross to the bench. Rachel stood halfway, searching his face for information he had not yet offered. He looked at both of them, then at the folder in Rachel's hands, then at the red hold stamp still visible through the top page. 10 minutes, he said. For one held stretch of silence, nothing changed except the vending machine hum and the tick of cooling pipes in the wall. Then the floor answered him. At first it came as a low vibration through the bench legs, subtle enough that Margot looked down at her shoes as if a cart were passing in the service tunnel below. And Sandra tilted her head toward the vent, because hospital buildings made their own strange music at night. The vibration deepened instead of fading. It moved up through tile and chair frames into shin bones and ribs, not loud yet, but dense, layered, mechanical in a way that belonged to engines working together at restrained idle. Vince did not turn toward the windows immediately. He watched Lily's shoulders. At the second pulse, she drew them tighter under the blanket, eyes on the folded flag, fingertips pausing on the stitched edge for the first time in nearly an hour. By 4:43, the sound had widened beyond a single direction. It came from the north entrance, the south ambulance loop, and the service road beyond pathology, each stream offset by seconds until the whole building seemed to sit inside one slow-moving chord. The corridor glass gave a faint tremor at the corners. A stainless tray on a utility cart rattled once, then settled. Sister Agnes rose from the bench without realizing she had stood, one hand braced on the vending machine, as if listening with her palm. Phil, at Security Desk B, lifted his radio, lowered it, and watched the monitor wall with the focused stillness of someone counting assets in motion. No one mistook the sound for chaos now. Vince stood and walked to the intake window. Rain had thinned to mist over the loading lane, and under the lot lights, the first row of headlamps turned as one, not rushed, not theatrical, each bike taking its mark in half-length adjustments, guided by hand signals and flashlight taps. Two abreast at the curb edge, four bike diamonds at crosswalk breaks, single-file reserve line held back by the retaining wall for emergency lane clearance. It looked less like a crowd and more like a field operation. He had seen convoy marshalling in desert dust and prison yard lineups before transfer buses. This was cleaner than both. A radio burst from Desk B cut through the hum. North Captain to hospital security, count update. Phil hit transmit. Go. The voice on the other end was wind rough and exact. 200, 12 North Gate, 187 South Loop, 94 Service Road East, 73 rotating overpass support, 34 in fuel and relief relay, total 650 on station. Phil repeated it back word for word and wrote it in block letters on the incident sheet. 650. He underlined it once. Ceremonial precision had a calming effect on frightened rooms. At 4:44, the next wave rolled in from Salem Avenue, and this one carried enough depth that the fluorescent fixtures gave a brief, sympathetic buzz. A resident at the second-floor rail stepped back from the glass. Two orderlies near pathology stopped whispering and simply watched. Margot, who had spent 20 years believing predictable paperwork was the highest form of control, slid the protocol packet into a plastic sleeve to keep it dry, and then set it flat, aligning corners she could not emotionally align with what was happening outside. Lily finally looked up. She did not ask who they were. Her gaze moved first to Vince, then to the window reflection, where black helmets and patched shoulders crossed one another in repeating lines, then to her mother's face. Rachel had one hand over her mouth again, but the tremor in her fingers had changed. It was no longer panic without direction. It was disbelief trying to make room for logistics. Vince crouched beside Lily's chair, keeping his voice low enough that it stayed inside their small space and did not turn into an announcement for the hall. "That noise is for your dad," he said. "Every bike out there is part of getting him home right." Lily swallowed and nodded once, the movement small and deliberate. "All of them?" "All of them." Outside, another count came in, this time from road captains at assigned intersections, where rain-dark traffic lights cycled over mostly empty lanes. Phil relayed as he wrote, "Route from Morgue Dock to Calvary verified at 27.4 miles, 29 controlled turns, 12 cross-street holds, 4 relief points for weather rotation, hearse flank teams pre-assigned." The words were administrative, almost dry. Their effect in the corridor was not. By 4:46, the rumble had become continuous, a living pressure in the chest rather than sound in the ear. It ran under dialogue and over the hum of vending motors, under the click of badge doors and over the soft shuffle of nurses switching stations. Vince felt it in the scar tissue near his left shoulder, a phantom ache old injuries sometimes offered when weather and adrenaline met. He let it ground him. He had promised 10 minutes. He had said yes. Now the promise had mass, headlights, and a verified count. Rachel stepped close enough that her sleeve brushed his jacket. "I thought maybe 10 minutes meant someone to talk to billing," she whispered. "It meant that too," he said. "But first, it meant this." At 4:47 on that same gray Wednesday, a city bus hissed to a stop beyond the far fence, doors opening to no passengers, while 650 motorcycles held position around a hospital that had required a child to wait barefoot, with a folded flag before anything moved quickly. The rumble did not peak and crash. It settled into discipline. Road captains began rotating engines down by sector to limit fumes near intake vents, alternating live idle lines so auditory presence remained while emissions dropped. Helmets came off and were clipped to bars. Rain covers were passed rear to front. Two independent riders in orange traffic ponchos walked the curb with measuring tape and chalk, marking hearse clearance points at the loading bay, according to hospital fire code, posted on the cinder block wall. No speeches, no revving for effect. Logistics replacing fear in real time. Inside, Vince watched three separate perceptions change on three separate faces. Phil's moved from threat assessment to coordination. Margot's moved from procedural defensiveness to transactional focus. Sandra's had changed earlier, but now it locked into the look she used when a case shifted from uncertain to actionable. She walked to Vince and held out a clipboard already pre-filled with account number, invoice totals, and release extension. "Your treasurer needs this order," she said. "He's 2 minutes out," Vince replied. Sister Agnes turned toward the window where a line of bikes stood under dripping maples, leather dark with rain, chrome catching ambulance strobes in brief red-white pulses. "Sometimes," she said quietly, mostly to herself, "the help arrives from where the chapel lever looked." No one argued with her. At 4:48, Eli Mercer came through the service entrance with Tomas Reed at one shoulder and Nora Pike at the other, all three wet to the cuffs. Eli and Tomas carried hard plastic document boxes sealed with zip ties. Nora, independent rider and licensed notary, had her helmet under one arm and a stamp kit in a waterproof pouch. Eli was 53, heavy through the chest, beard gone iron gray, reading glasses hanging on a cord over his patch. Tomas, chapter treasurer, thin as fence wire, former union bookkeeper, had fingers already ink-stained from receipt paper. They did not pause to absorb the scene. They moved to the counter. Tomas set one box on the ledge and clicked it open. Stacks of cashier's checks, debit cards, cash envelopes labeled by amount, duplicate receipt books, and a calculator wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. He looked at Margot once. "Run every line item," he said. "No rounding, no bundled estimates. We pay what's due, and you print each receipt as it clears." Margot nodded before she caught herself nodding. The sound outside held steady, no longer a warning, now a scaffold. And with the count confirmed and the finance team in place, the second part began. Vince stepped back to the corridor center and gave one short signal with his hand. Road captains closest to the glass saw it and relayed outward in a chain, left fist to chest, open palm down, 2 taps to shoulder. Formation instruction, not theater. Bikes on perimeter shifted by inches to create protected channels from intake to service bay, from service bay to loading dock, from loading dock to hearse lane. Riders on foot moved to fixed points every 15 yards inside visual contact of one another, leaving all badge doors unobstructed and every emergency path clear to code. Phil verified each lane on camera and spoke the clearances into his recorder for liability documentation. The wall went up without anyone calling it that. 2 riders took post at the family room door, not blocking entry, simply present, hands folded in front, eyes outward toward traffic flow. 4 stood at the corridor mouth where curious staff had started to cluster, making a human edge that discouraged gawking without a single spoken command. 6 more spaced along the service bay awning to shield Rachel and Lily from rain and cameras when transfer time came. At the north curb, pairs rotated every 7 minutes to keep hands warm and focus sharp. At the south loop, flanking teams rehearsed hearse pace at walking speed, then reset. By 4:51, the hospital had an operational perimeter more efficient than any plan in its own emergency binder. Rachel watched through glass and then back at Vince, trying to parse men she had been taught to fear into roles she could trust with her husband's last trip home. Lily did not watch long. She reached for her shoes, pulled them on carefully, and retied each lace in a double knot, fingers slow from cold but exact. The telling detail landed in Vince like a quiet weight. Prepared child behavior in a corridor built for adults who said they were too busy. He knelt to her level again. "You stay between me and your mom when we move," he said. "No rushing, just walking." She nodded. "Okay." Sandra stepped beside them, badge swinging once at her hip. "Transfer of paperwork is being released to billing now," she said. "I'll walk with you to dock when the hearse is called." "Thank you," Vince said. External contacts kept resolving in sequence. Social services called back at 4:52 after seeing the security escalation note. Sandra answered, documented immediate community protective presence, and secured expedited daytime case follow-up for Lily without removal action. County Release Desk returned Margot's escalation ping at 4:53, asked whether full settlement was verifiable, and received Tomas's ledger numbers and card authorizations in real time. Protocol 11C did not bend, but it no longer blocked. It was being satisfied line by line. Outside, rain eased to a mist so fine it looked like breath in the lot lights. Engines idled in alternating sectors, a controlled throb that stayed in the bones. Inside, Tomas fed charges through the terminal with machine patience while Nora stamped affidavit fields where signatures required witness. Eli stood with a yellow legal pad, checking each paid line against the estimate and circling discrepancies for immediate correction. No grandstanding, no raised voices, just transaction after transaction, converting a hold into release. The wall held. When a pair of early shift visitors tried to cut through the corridor for a shortcut to elevators, one of the posted riders stepped aside just enough to guide them around Lily's chair and Rachel's space with a polite tilt of his hand. They complied without protest, eyes dropping from Patches to the child, and then away. Loaded assumptions paid off and dissolved in one movement. At 4:55, with receipts beginning to stack in a neat clipped bundle beside the terminal, and the perimeter settled from curb to intake door, Vince rested one hand lightly on the back of Lily's chair and looked out at 650 riders keeping rain, traffic, and scrutiny at measurable distance. Protection in the end looked like route maps, clear lanes, paid invoices, and people who stayed at their posts until the smallest person in the room could walk without fear. At 4:56, Tomas tore the next receipt from the duplicate book and slid both copies across the counter to Margot, who stamped each one with a firm downward press that left blue ink ridges visible through the paper. The terminal approved the transport line, then the preparation line, then the administrative release fee that had held everything in place for hours. Nora Pike notarized the final affidavit with a quick turn of her wrist and blotted the seal so it would not smear in the damp. Eli checked each amount against the original estimate, read the totals aloud once, and circled the last figure on his legal pad. 14,810 cleared. No balance pending. Release authorized. He handed the pad to Rachel so she could see the circle with her own eyes. Rachel stared at the number, blinked twice, and looked up at Margot as if waiting for the sentence that usually followed bad news. Margot's shoulders dropped an inch. "Mrs. Hale," she said, voice rougher than before, "Protocol 11C is satisfied. I'm printing your release now." She fed the packet through the printer and, for the first time that night, aligned the pages for Rachel with careful hands instead of brisk ones. The red hold stamp was crossed through by a diagonal black line and a timestamp, 5:01 a.m. Vince stayed beside Lily's chair while paperwork changed status from blocked to cleared. Outside, engines held their low rotation in alternating sectors, the sound steady enough now that the corridors seemed built around it. Sandra took the printed social services callback note from her pocket and read the case number to Rachel, then wrote it in thick marker on the manila folder so it could not be lost in a coat pocket or a purse. MC-SS-44719, responder assigned at 8:15. Follow up at Family Services Office on Friday. Transportation voucher approved. She added her own direct extension under it. If they bounce you to voicemail, call me, she said. Rachel nodded and folded the paper into the folder with the receipts. Physical evidence was no longer loose on counters. It was gathered, labeled, and in her hands. Phil from security brought a thin incident file in a clear sleeve. Camera still time-stamped, 2/24/17, hallway log of 39 passers, lane clearance verification sheets, and his own notation that emergency access had remained open throughout motorcycle staging. He gave it to Sandra for records, then looked at Vince. You were right about the turn radius, he said. 12 feet clear all night. It was as close to an apology as the man was built to offer. Vince gave one short nod. At 5:04, the chaplain who had paused at 2:25 did not return, and no one went looking for him. Sister Agnes finally fixed the wrong buttons on her cardigan. With fingers that had gone stiff in the cold draft near intake, then stepped close to Lily and crouched so their eyes met. You did very well waiting, she said. Lily studied the silver cross at her collar, then the hearing aid in her left ear, and gave a small, solemn nod. No smile, no theatrics. Sister Agnes touched the edge of the folded blanket, asked permission with her eyes, and tucked one corner around Lily's knee where the tights were torn. By 5:07 on that same gray Wednesday, the city's first full commuter wave had not yet started, and the streets between Dayton Regional and Calvary Cemetery still belonged mostly to delivery vans, sanitation trucks, and rain. The hearse backed to the service dock at 5:09, tires whispering on wet concrete, wipers ticking a metronome against the windshield. 2 riders in rain covers checked wheel chocks, then stepped away. 4 veterans from the chapter took position by the loading rail, gloves on, movements exact and quiet. Vince walked Rachel and Lily to the awning with Sandra on Rachel's left, and Sister Agnes 1 pace behind. The mist found every exposed surface and settled there. On Vince's scar, on Lily's lashes, on the ash-smudged corner of the folded flag she still carried. When the transfer team emerged, no one spoke. The only sounds were hydraulic hiss, rain on metal, and the far-layered idle of 650 engines holding formation. Lily moved closer to Vince until her sleeve brushed his jacket. He lowered his hand, palm open. She placed her small hand in it without looking up. Her fingers were cold and dry, his hand rough with healed fractures and old road cuts, and that contact stayed fixed while the gurney locked, released, and rolled into place. That was the image people kept. Road captains lifted arms in sequence. North line rolled first, then south, then service road support feeding into staggered pairs. The procession moved out at 5:16, disciplined and slow, 2 abreast where lanes allowed, single file at narrowed turns, 4 bike blocks at major intersections. 29 controlled turns, 12 cross-street holds, 27.4 miles from dock to graveside, each mile staffed and timed. Vince rode left flank near the hearse for the first 8 miles, then rotated to Rachel's support vehicle when rain thickened near the river bridges. Lily sat in the back seat with the flag on her lap and counted under her breath at red lights, lips moving with each bike that passed her window in measured lines. She stopped at 53 because the numbers came too fast after that, and simply watched chrome and wet leather stream by like a moving wall. At each hold point, riders stood off bikes with palms out to traffic. No shouting, no posturing, just clear signals and patient faces in rain. On Troy Street, a bakery worker stepped onto the curb with flour on his sleeves and removed his cap. On KOE, 2 sanitation crews parked their truck and stood by the guardrail while the hearse passed. At the overpass near Route 35, reserve riders who had staged since before dawn folded into the rear in clean zipper merge, closing gaps without touching brakes. The rumble never broke rhythm. It moved through storefront glass and bus shelters and church brick and came back as vibration in the chest. At 5:58, they turned through Calvary's stone gate. Rain had thinned to a mist so light it looked like breath above the grass. Riders peeled to assigned rows and killed engines in a wave that traveled front to back. One click of ignitions after another until the sound narrowed to ticking metal, distant crows, and the soft grind of tires on cemetery gravel. The sudden quiet landed harder than the noise had. At graveside, folding chairs sank a little into wet ground. Rachel stood with both hands around the folder that now held every cleared receipt, every stamped page, every number that had tried to stop this morning and failed. Sandra, off shift and still in scrubs under a borrowed rain shell, stood at the edge of the family row because she had said she would walk with them and had. Sister Agnes stood beside her with uncovered hair damp at the temples, cardigan finally right button. Lily stepped out of the support car, looked at the mud around the chairs, and bent to untie her shoes. She set them side by side on the folded chair seat, toes even, laces tucked, exactly as she had lined them on the hospital tile. Then she walked in wet socks across the grass and knelt beside her mother. Vince moved to her right, 1 pace back, then lowered his hand when she reached for it, without turning her head. She held on through the final prayers and through the honor guard's folded silence, her hand a small anchor in his. When the last formal words ended and people began to shift, Rachel looked up at the ring of riders surrounding the section in quiet rows, rain dark on their shoulders, faces turned outward to give her space. She exhaled once, long and unguarded, and for the first time since the corridor, she did not look like someone bracing for the next refusal. Vince leaned toward Lily and spoke the only line anyone repeated later. He goes home with honor. By 6:22, Tomas had placed copies of all paid receipts in a waterproof envelope for Rachel and a duplicate set in the chapter file box. Margot's release authorization had been scanned into hospital records. Phil's incident report, with a 39-person log and camera still, had been filed to administration. Sandra had a signed handoff from social services confirming Friday intake, and the folded blanket from intake, washed and sealed by housekeeping at Sandra's request, sat in Rachel's trunk beside the folder and Lily's shoes. Sometimes the center calls itself order, while leaving the smallest person in the room to carry the weight alone. Sometimes the margins arrive in rain and leather and do, mile by mile, what the center would not.